Conor O'Neill here from Everyday Athlete, where we work with everyday athletes who want to pursue their athletic goals in endurance running, strength training, physique change, and sport. In this podcast, my guests and I discuss principles, strategies, and stories that may help you in pursuit of your own athletic goals and in your life outside of that too. I remember first coming across your stuff, or maybe not knowing it necessarily was your stuff, but coming across the GA clips of you outlining, different players' tactics and speed and change of direction and within match scenarios. And then once you came out with the Backdoor Cut podcast, from just being aware of Owen and Dara as well, and then getting into listening to that, that's sort of where I originally come across your stuff and followed you on from there. But with obviously this being a podcast, and just off air we were talking about podcasts as well, I was wondering, how did the podcast itself come about, and why, with the format that it has been in, where did that sort of structure come about, and what was the idea behind it?
First off, thanks for having me on. I'm not sure when we started recording, but it's good that we're into it now and into the questions. So thanks, Conor, for having me on. It's always a privilege to be asked to offer, I suppose, my thoughts. So thanks for that. In relation to the start of the podcast, the start of the Petey Performance podcast, I actually had this conversation earlier, and it was just simply during COVID. I had a gym, it got shut down. I had way more free time than I had when the gym was operational. So I said, what would be a nice alternative to put my efforts into to continue to grow business, grow my thoughts, and grow my brand, rather than just sitting on my hole doing nothing. So I had a podcast in the back of my head for a number of years because I thought I was well networked and had a good network. I did, I suppose, but I didn't realize the extent that probably you need to go in order to have a podcast grow, and how difficult it is. But I sat down one day, and it was when the Six Nations was on, but there was no one going to the games. And I was coaching rugby at the time. Rugby is my background, really. And I just said I was just going to put forward my thoughts on what I saw and a review of the fixtures at the weekend. Actually, it may have been a preview for the Six Nations, the first episode. Maybe the second episode was a review. But I just started talking, and it was pretty raw back then. I think I just left everything in and just posted it up. I can't even remember where I posted that. And then put a link on my Instagram page for people to listen. And I was blown away by how many people actually listened to it. Probably because they had nothing to do during COVID, but they listened nonetheless. So I said I'd do it again the following week. I just kept rolling and I kept going. And I didn't really know what the podcast was at that stage, but I knew people were listening, and I knew I was getting followers out of it. I was getting attention, which is today's currency, and more people were connecting with me for conversations, which led to more opportunities to do business with them, I suppose, or get them in for PTing or for training at the time, which is what I was doing. So that's when my podcasting journey started, and then I just kept it going as I transitioned online. I got a job with a GA club in Dublin, Thomas Davis GA club, and it was with the senior footballers. After a year, it transpired that I got offered a role with both the senior ladies, the senior hurlers, and with the underage development as well. So I took that, and it kind of merged into what was titled by me and by them as head of athletic development, but it really was a full-time coaching role, and I had one assistant with me. And as I continued into that space, what I was doing and dealing with daily was more GAA related. So more of my content started going in a GAA direction. My network started building in terms of GAA as well. And I started realizing that Gaelic games are so much bigger than rugby in Ireland. I was going to say worldwide, probably not, but in Ireland, definitely. So I just kept rolling with that. And then one day I was scrambling for content or things to put together. And I remember I used to do reels or breakdowns of videos of different skills from across different sports. So I might have one picture or one video of a basketball player doing a cut, then a hurler, then I might have a footballer, then I might have a soccer player, then I might have a rugby player. And then one day I saw Paul Mannion for Crokes do a step where he cut back in the inside and then knocked it over to his left. And I just slowed it down, talked over it, and put it on Instagram. And it got like tens of thousands of views. And I was like, geez, there's something here, I suppose. So then my editor at the time, Sophie, said to me, are you on TikTok yet? And I said, no. And she said, well, you probably should be on TikTok. So I put it on TikTok and it got hundreds of thousands of views. And then I realized maybe I should continue doing some of these. So then, like, I just kept watching more GAA. I was watching more Gaelic football anyway. I would have been a hurling man before that, being from North Tipperary, and would have watched all Tips games. But I started watching more football and spotting and seeing different skills, and then just started breaking them down and putting them on social media, and then started getting more business, more views and listens for the podcast. It continued to grow. And then I got to a stage towards the end of last year where I just had an idea, basing it off what was going on in the NBA in America and what was going on in the NRL and the AFL in Australia, of players were given more insight into what they were getting up to on the daily and their training, say days, maybe their off days, and doing vlogs or podcasts and giving their opinions. And I had Dara and Owen in my network. I knew Owen through a mentorship I did with Sam Portland, and Dara I had on the podcast and had just conversed with. And I pitched them the idea that we do a through the season like insight into the life of an inter-county athlete. And they thought it was a great idea. So we said we'd put together a few podcasts and see how they went. And we managed to get Matty Donnelly on one of the first ones. And we got thousands of downloads on each of the first 4 episodes. So I had actually made the decision to move to Australia just as we released it. So I headed off, and the boys were kind of saying to me, well, you better get back here to continue with this. So I said I'd do the summer in Oz, come back when the championship started. So I came back for the first week of championship, and we've tried to put together weekly episodes with guests from in and around the GAA scene, generally Gaelic football. It's been challenging because of the culture of like silence and like closed offedness within the GAA, but that was one of the, say, areas that I identified as being as why there was a gap in the market and why it could be so massive if we were successful in this, and how we could position ourselves well. So we're still going with it. We're towards the end of the season. It has been challenging, but it's been a worthwhile challenge, and I'm glad I came back to do it and to just give it a go. And that leads us to where I am now, where I'm trying to run 2 podcasts, which was too many for me at the time while I'm running another business, because I'm not a full-time podcaster, but I was working like one there for a while. So I'm currently doing my own one, the Petey Performance podcast. Lots of solo episodes there as well. I'm going to record one after this, actually. And then I'm trying to get the Backdoor Cook crew together to get episodes out weekly as well. So, and then I'm getting invited onto fantastic podcasts like yourself. I like your own one here now as well, to give my thoughts there. So always flattering, but that's how we've got to where we are over the last few years, I guess, in a quick or maybe a long synopsis.
It is interesting because I spoke to Daniel Davey a couple of episodes back as well, and he remarked on the closed offness of GA players. He actually told a story that he was on a plane and saw a couple of high profile GA players in the back of the plane, and said, I'll go over and chat. They might know me, they might not, but I'll chat, just tell them who I am or whatever. And he could feel how closed off they were. He presumed that they sort of knew him, they was on social media, and maybe there was a closed offness there of them, him relaying a story back through social media or something like that, of something they might have said. But it is a strange thing in one way, because, as you say, in a lot of other sports, it's almost seen as part of the job description, although it's not a job in the GAA context. But you watched the Tour de France documentary there lately, and you could see after a bad performance, some of the riders going into the bus and not wanting to do the press, and the crew members actually saying, no, you sort of need to do this, it'll be good for you, it'll be good for the team, everything else. And it's sort of part and parcel of what they do, as opposed to the GAA teams. It's the complete opposite. It's like, don't say anything, and maybe there is a slight change in that, but it's very good as a listener, and I'm sure as maybe even especially as a young player coming up, to see insights into what the guys at the top are thinking about, how they are going about the performance, how they're going about the preparation, and also just to see that they're real people behind this athlete potential facade as well. And I know one of the things that you have touched on a lot in your own stuff, but also the three of you guys on the podcast have talked about in different contexts, is dealing with injury and the rehab process and the return to play process. And I know from my own experience and just from talking to people and talking to clients that the rehab process, especially at say club level GAA, potentially maybe some county levels, is probably subpar. Maybe just at worst is potentially just get injured, you rest to let it heal, in quotation marks, and maybe throw in a few low intensity banded exercises and a few jogs up and down the pitch in the hope that you'll be back to where you were beforehand and able to play. Whereas I know your process is a lot more active when it comes to rehabbing and returning to play and getting back to where the person was previously, or hopefully beyond it. And I wonder, what does that look like for you in terms of that journey and the phases along the way from an injury to back to performance levels that you want to be at?
I won't give you the "it depends" answer, because it does depend, but I'll tell a story because I think people can connect with a story a little bit more. I have had huge experience with injury as an athlete in the past, so that led me to realize, I suppose, or figure out that injuries don't just heal with rest at all. Like any sort of chronic issue or an issue where the tissue has been damaged in some way, you need to give it time to settle. But if you're resting passively, then other tissues as well as that tissue are probably going to be detrained. And as a result of that, you're probably going to be in a worse position in terms of your physical profile and your physical readiness to play when you return to the field, if that's all you've done. Through my trials and tribulations with injury, I started to realize that you needed to load tissue in order to elicit adaptation, get it a little bit stronger, get it more robust. When I went in first into the GAA, I went in the middle of the season during COVID, and we had a small group, so not many on the squad of the senior panel, about maybe 23, 24, which is not a lot for Dublin. And close to 10 of those probably were all out with hamstring injuries for the most part, probably 80% hamstring injuries. So I started to realize, what have you been doing? And they said they were trying to do more and more strength work. And I realized that, like, strength work, okay, it might solve some injury issues in terms of eliciting adaptation to tissue, but it's not really very specific to the demands of the game. And these athletes had been doing a lot of strength work throughout COVID. They'd also been running long distances, so their aerobic capacity was good, but yet they were still getting injured. So what was it? I was tasked with trying to get these players on the field for championships, some of them with acute injuries within 10 days. I had to do my best to get these guys on the field. I spoke to loads and loads of experts in their fields. I did a digging through the research, and back then I was probably still pretty raw, but I thought that the answer lay in not solely doing heavy eccentrics and strength training, but it lay in doing isometrics, bleeding in plyometrics as well, and then doing an extensive amount of tempo running, as well as some progression in terms of sprint work to give the tissue the appropriate loading in which it's probably getting injured. That then led into more deceleration work as well, because obviously hamstring injuries, or the mechanism of injury, could be getting up to max speed, it could be at max speed, or it could be coming down, so decel. So that was something that I was semi-successful with. So then as a result of that, I started getting more people coming to me with these repetitive injuries to try and sort them out. I started learning from people much smarter than me, like David Gray. I did a mentorship with Alan Murdoch. I spoke to loads of different people in the industry, and my framework for addressing injuries, acute injuries or chronic, kind of began to mold. And I'm at the stage now where probably 80 to 90% of the individuals that work with me are working with me through the return to play process, or the middle stage rehab process. So it's taken up a lot of my time. So the more of it I've done, the more things I've noticed, the more robust my framework has become. Each injury is slightly different. However, there are commonalities that I see with specific injuries. So what I'll take into account when I speak to the person first is I will liaise with their physio or their therapist and ask them where the site of injury is, what the mechanism of injury is, what else is going on in this individual's life, what age are they, what's their injury history, what position do they play, how do they play the game. So are they more of an intermittent type player where they'll be more anaerobic, say, they'll perform a sprint, take a break for 4 minutes and then perform another sprint? Or are they more aerobic in nature and they'll do a great deal of high-speed running on the field at maybe a tempo kind of intensity, and then they'll just cover a lot of ground essentially? Because that is something I noticed through the use of GPS and working within the GAA as well, is we have treated in the past all of the players the exact same, but one guy can be playing the game in a totally different way to a different guy, and they could be playing in the exact same position. It's the different roles that they have. It's what works for them. So why are we training those two players the exact same when the game demands or the movement demands of the game are slightly different? All of this led to me identifying that, look, the GAA season is manic. Like, it's crazy. The amount of games is huge. There's only so much stress you can give to an individual to get them stronger, get them faster, get them cutting, and get them moving better. They have to play all these games as well as challenge games sometimes. Don't get me started on them. But as a result of that, they only have so much energy that they can expend across the week. So they're limited in terms of their development due to the demands of the fixture schedule, except for when they become injured. And when they become injured, the tissue has not been able to tolerate the demands that have been placed on it. What we can do then is we can stress that specific injury site in order to get it stronger, which we can do through strength work, isometrics, eccentrics, through plyometrics as well. But we have the time now to try to get the athlete moving more efficiently, so that their risk of injury goes down. And then as well as that, get them moving more effectively thereafter, so that they're actually faster at sprinting, they're faster at cutting, their aerobic capacity potentially is better. And as a result of all of these things, their physical capacity and going up and them being in a better place, then their likelihood and risk of injury when they return to the pitch is going to be lower, because we're not returning them at the same level as when they got injured. Because how can we expect them to not get injured again if we just return them to the field at the exact same level where they got injured in the past, or even in some cases at a worse level? So that's where all of my time has spent. And then if I had to break it into phases, then Obviously, after they've seen the physio, they've been diagnosed and they've had their period of rest to allow the injury to settle, which doesn't need to be very long, to be honest, in my estimation and from my experience. We can even start loading other tissues if we can't, even if we're letting that tissue that has become injured settle. It depends on the severity of the injury, obviously, and the mechanism of injury and the site of injury. But I believe any sort of detraining is probably not that advantageous. So we might as well try to retain what qualities we've got already so we can push them on after that. After that's settled, then we're maybe returning to loading. After we return to loading, we've got or we've led to some sort of an increase in their strength and their capacity, and we've maybe ironed out the deficit that was there. Or potentially we've got that deficit back to the level that it was at, because sometimes they'll present with a deficit in terms of limb to limb already. Once we've done that, we're probably returning to landing or returning to jumping. That's probably the next phase. Then we're trying to return them to running after they've went through some extensive plyometrics and some more intensive ones as well. Once we get them back to the field, now that return to running won't be just your jogging, plodding, which does take up a lot of the game of Gaelic football or the game of hurling. However, it's probably not when they've got injured. Their aerobic system's probably well developed already, so we don't need to really improve in that regard. So I bias probably higher intensity activities. So that return to running may in fact be return to running mechanics drills in which they'll get up to a velocity, so a speed of movement that is greater than that of jogging and plodding. As well as that, the energy cost of the jogging and plodding is probably going to be extremely high. And depending on where the injury site is as well, different muscles will be more active and will have to do more at the jogging, plodding kind of lower intensity of injury than will have to act in the more higher velocity, maybe high speed running and above, maybe closer to sprint distance intensity. So I'll bias those and try to get them to move more efficiently. After we've got them through those extensive running, well, not extensive, but those running drills and that running protocol of high intensity running mechanics drills, and they can tolerate that okay, I'll know they'll be able to tolerate a decent amount of high speed running intensity. So then I might move them from there into return to sprinting and return to lower level kind of change of direction drills. So non-reactive, like they're doing and executing the movement not in response to anything in their own time. And then we'll progress from a short sprint distance to a long sprint distance with them. After we have that, then we're returning to change of direction and deceleration, and then we're returning to conditioning, returning to training, and then return to running. That might sound like a lot to people. They're like, sure, if it's a minor hamstring strain, that's going to take weeks and weeks and weeks. Not really, because those phases will overlap to an extent. It's kind of like a continuum. So you're never really solely in one phase or at one site. You're overlapping between those phases all of the time. So even in the phase of, say, return to sprinting, we're still going to be doing strength work, and we're still going to be doing our ISOs, and we'll still be doing our plyos, but we might have less of an emphasis placed on them. It's similar to vertical integration as a programming strategy for GAA, which most GAA athletes will do. You're not really using block or linear periodization at all. At least not many are doing it, where they'll move in the traditional model of hypertrophy, strength, power, because you're having to perform every week, so it doesn't really work like that. So a big question you asked, so it required a big answer, but I hope that's enough depth for you there now.
Absolutely. It's there are a lot of different threads we could pull on there. But one interesting thing that came to me was when you're talking about that aspect of, instead of going for the approach of plodding along and that low intensity running, which, as you said, probably isn't needed as much because they're probably aerobically quite fit, and that type of fitness tends to hang around a little bit longer anyway. And you're still going to get some of that from you're certainly going to get some of that from the tempo running anyway. Is it the case that you would say, rather than starting at low intensity exercises at high volumes and bringing the intensity gradually up but keeping the volume, you're going for more of an approach of saying we're starting at relatively high intensity but low volumes and bringing the volumes up along with obviously the intensity as well, but you're starting at a higher intensity than traditionally, and you're still working always within that higher intensity, but modulating volume up rather than the other approach of bringing intensity up.
Yeah, you've nailed it, really. People will be surprised the velocities that they'll hit when they're doing, say, an ankling drill or a plyo, any sort of running mechanics drill, like a frontside dribble bleed is what I would use a lot, so a dribble protocol. So we start at, I wouldn't call it high intensity because it's still probably just above 60%, maybe closer to like 60 to maybe capping at about 80-85% of your max velocity. Now, I have seen elite athletes hit closer to 90+% of their max velocity in dribble protocol, but I haven't really seen it that much with GAA athletes unless I get the speed gates out, because when I do that, then they just want to run fast, so they just go fast. So we start with a low volume of that after we've at least checked their tolerance in the weeks prior to lower intensity running mechanics drills. So your ankling, your dribbling, your A skip, your A march, maybe pulled some sleds on a march, so a really heavy load with a march. And then we've extended the distance out to, say, I'd use the 10-30 protocol a lot, which I've taken from Alan Murdoch. He's taught me it essentially, and I've used it to great effect, where it's a 30-meter dribble bleed. You're building up, and we're measuring your efficiency in the 20 to 30 meter zone, and we're also measuring your effectiveness in terms of the speed that you hit in that zone. And I remember I had an assistant out with me last year who was working in Santry, and they have a different approach to their return to play, which I'm not saying is wrong. It's just different. It can work for some people some of the time, but I found mine works probably more frequently than other alternatives I've used in the past, especially for reintegrating the athlete back to return to play. But he was observing me doing the 10-30 dribble bleed protocol, which is that 10 times. So we might split it up in terms of the first week, you might do 3 sets of 3 and 1 of 1. And then we increase the density across the sessions. So then we might go 2 by 5. Then after that, we might do 1 of 6 and 1 of 4. So you might have 60 to 90 seconds in between those reps. And then you might have 120 to 180 seconds in between the sets. When the athlete can do 60-second repeated effort, so every 60 seconds, 10 times back to back in one full set, I'd be pretty confident that they're going to be okay to sprint, because that is repeated sprinting. They're getting up to probably, as I said, 80-85% of their max velocity, 90% of their max velocity at that stage, because they've been through the process. So we have the same volume, but the density is increasing. The intensity of those, and this is what shocked him, was he had a look at the GPS data, which I was looking at on my phone. StatSports is great for this, actually, of the live sessions. And he just went, holy Jesus, because he saw the high-speed running that the athlete had gone through. And the high-speed running that the athlete had gone through from doing 10 of those efforts, this wasn't back-to-back. This was earlier stages, actually, after the injury or post-injury. So I think we maybe did 3 sets, probably 1 of 4 and 2 of 3 potentially. And it exceeded the high speed running that athlete would have done probably if we'd just done tempo. But he's not just covering it at that intensity. He's getting up to a higher intensity when doing it as well as he's changing his movement strategy. So he's now running in a more front side bias strategy than he would usually. And this particular athlete would have been what I call an over rotator. So he kind of leaned over and almost falls over when he's accelerating. So he strikes in front of his center of mass and almost pulls himself forward. So he's really inefficient. And when he's striking in front of his center of mass, his hamstrings, his quads, like there's a big stretch on that because he's having to balance and having to use his reflex, essentially, his catch reflex, to stop himself from falling over, his stumble reflex to stop himself falling over, which leads to a lot of load going through those tissues. So we this guy actually had been through the ringer with hamstring injuries. So I knew that we had to try and change his strategy. So we were doing that whilst working on all these other things. And he was getting more confident as well because he was pushing the intensity every single time, because I would tell him what speed he hit after every run. And when he's on his way back, we've 90 seconds in between efforts. I am going through the video and then showing him the positions that he's hitting as well. So he's also getting more efficient. So we're biasing intensity, definitely, but it's holistic in terms of we're not just looking at the intensity in the running demands, because I also appreciate that it's not just what you do in terms of injury, and this is through trial and error, and through looking at the GPS and still having injuries. It's how you do it that matters. So that's where I land now with it, and that is quite a labor intensive method for me, I suppose, in that I have to watch a lot of efforts. But if you watch a lot of efforts, you get quite good at watching them. Your coaching eye develops. So I'd say I have quite an acute or quite a well-developed coaching eye now for these specific movement patterns and for identifying points of improvement and potential deficiencies. But if I'm questioning what I'm seeing, which I do all the time, like all good coaches do, because we know that we probably sometimes can overestimate our abilities, then I'll just run it into AI and I'll use view motion, and then usually what happens is it gives me back what I was seeing anyway. Sometimes it gives me back something else as well, but I think it's natural to have a little bit of absence of confidence in your own coaching eye, but that's something that comes gradually, but you're never fully confident, because if you're fully confident that you know exactly what you're seeing, you're probably overconfident and you're probably a little bit of a charlatan, I'd say. You're believing your own hype, essentially, is what I'd say.
Yeah, I suppose that's you get confident with what you do most. I suppose that relates as well to the actual confidence of an athlete coming back from injury too. And you mentioned they're exposing them to those higher speeds from physiological point of view, but also from the point of view of confidence. And that's one aspect that plays into a player's willingness to return to play, along with other aspects that you would be, I'm sure, assessing to assess whether is someone able to return to play. And that, I'm sure, gets contrasted with the demand of management to have their player available, especially if it's a good player. So I'm wondering, in your interactions potentially with management and with the player themselves, how are you going about managing that desire to get back, but also the reality of whether they're actually ready to come back physiologically and mentally too?
With a lot of difficulty, I'd say. That would be the answer. But it's challenging because the athlete identifies as a footballer or as a hurler or as a camogue. So when that aspect of their life is taken away from them, they don't know what to do. And it's a traumatic experience. They're experiencing grief, they're experiencing loss. So they can become frustrated as a result of that, and they want to run the risk. Now, in the past, what I would have done was I would have laid out for them what they had to pass in terms of metrics for the rehab process and KPIs for the rehab process, in order for us to be expectant that they won't become re-injured when they return to the field of play. And then I would have said to management who are pushing, either, look, I don't think that they should play, but it's up to you. You pick them if you want. Or I think they're probably ready and they can probably do this amount of minutes. You pick them if you want. If you want to go over that, that's on you, but this is what I'm recommending. I found that I usually got my way when I did that, because I was throwing it onto the management. Sometimes you have to preface to the injured party as well, so the athlete and that you're working with, that, look, the risk of injury is high, but if it's championship, they're going to want to run the risk anyway. So they can run the risk if they want, but it's essentially you not having the liability, I suppose, and saying, like, look, I don't think you're really ready yet, but if you want to give it a go, then you may not get injured, and that would be great, but you may get injured as well. Now, since then, I've actually had a conversation with Dr. John Kiley, and he does a lot of work with a lot of teams in the Premier League. And he said I was almost correct in how I was prefacing that. And he told me a story about when he was away at the World Cup and one of their top players with Egypt was injured. The way you should go through this process is you should put a number or a value on it in terms of a percentage that you think attributes their likelihood of re-injury or their likelihood of not becoming injured. Once you do that and you give a numerical value to it, then there's full transparency between athlete, coach and player what the chances are that they become re-injured are. The management and the athlete then can run that risk if they want. So say you said, if they play, I'm not that confident given where they are in terms of the process that they're not going to become re-injured. I'd say their likelihood of re-injury is probably not really high because I think they're at a high level already. It's probably in and around 66% chance that they don't get injured, 33% chance that they do. So a 1 in 3 chance. The athlete and the management, if they're playing the semi-final of the championship against a strong outfit and it's a must-win game, they might run the risk of that. But if it's a group game, you're already through the group, and that's the likelihood of injury, then they might say, what do you think it could be in 2 weeks' time when our next fixture is? And I could say, well, confidently, all going well, I think we could get that down to maybe 75%, 80% chance that this specific issue doesn't crop up again the next day they turn out. But there's still a 20% chance. And that never gets to zero. But then there can be full confidence that everybody's on the same page in regards to where the athlete is. The athlete can't argue with the KPIs and with the metrics of the rehab process and the movement demands and what they're actually hitting. So it's not my opinion in that regard, whereas the injury risk is my opinion based on my experience in the past and where the athlete is within that return to play framework and their level of physical function at that stage. But you're either running at 9 meters per second or you're not, basically. So that's a lot easier to get across to the athlete because that's not my opinion. That's just what the GPS is telling us that they're hitting. So it's quite rational in that perspective, but I've probably got better over the years at realizing that rehab is not always a rational process because you're dealing with emotions. So how you put across or convey that information is very important as well. So it can't be very cold and direct. Sometimes it needs to be, but a lot of the time you need to kind of give it with a pinch of salt, I suppose. So that's how I've navigated it in the past. I don't know if that's how I'll always navigate it, but generally that's how I do it at the moment as well. And you wouldn't believe, well, maybe you would because you're working in the GAA, but how many messages I'm getting on a daily basis at the moment of athletes being like, oh, there's a match there at the weekend. I know you said like we have another few weeks and we have to hit this, but what do you think about 30 minutes at the weekend? And you just have to maybe bring them back to the conversation you had previously and what has been outlined in terms of what's expected of them and what they're capable of. And we know they're capable of it because they were hitting it pre-injury as well. And then, they want to play, so their memory can be a little bit short, I suppose, at times.
Yeah, it's nice to have that, I suppose, blend of objective and subjective. I think even with given the somewhat subjective ratings, I'm sure that allows you to then calibrate those ratings over time, because if you give a 66% rating that they'll be okay at one time and then they get injured, your next time someone's in that same position, you're probably going to say 50%, or it's
absolutely
self calibrating as such. You also said about
and that was Connor, that was true. Years of people getting injured again, because in Thomas Davis and Tala, it's a small club in Dublin, so they don't have that many on the senior panel, on any of them really. So you're tasked with the best players needing to play or wanting to play in the championship. So I got quite good, or I got better at least, at giving the prediction based on the evidence of what they had got through in terms of the return to play process, whether they got injured or not. But you're constantly reminded that it's not perfect by injury. And to my detriment, because I now give a lot of my personal identity to my effectiveness in my job. If somebody did become injured and I had said that they're probably good to go, even though I know now that I can't ultimately control that, there's way too many variables, way too many factors, I would take it so personally, and I would be like, that's my fault that happened. I didn't prepare them well enough and I gave the wrong recommendation. Now, there's a drawback or a negative to that as well, because I shouldn't be feeling the way I'm feeling. But the positive is that I would go like to the nth degree, go pooling through or delving through as much research and going through my own process and having more and more conversations to refine it and become more robust as a result. So you're constantly going over it. But I'm not just pulling the percentages out of my arse. It's out of everything that I've seen working with 4 teams and then another club then at the exact same time over the last 5-6 years, and now working with athletes, as I said, through injury on the daily. So I'm getting better, I suppose, at giving those estimations, because they are educated guesses at the end of the day. They're not concrete. Like, I know that if you start to believe your own bullshit, then it becomes bullshit, essentially. So it is an interesting one, as you said, but people might probably think that I'm just pulling a number out. But it's off the evidence and off experience, essentially.
Yeah, and there's skin in the game there too. I mean, if you're given overly optimistic ratings and people are going out and getting re-injured all the time, you don't want that. But also, if you're the guy who's coming into a club and no one gets to play, because they're always injured, or because you're saying they're always injured, then you have the skin in the game of saying, yeah, he's not the guy either. So you want to be optimal with that. You have an incentive there. But I suppose either way, if you're a bit iffy, I suppose, on whether a player should be back or not, because I know it's something you spoke about as well, the language around that is important. And if you are going to a player and you're actually quite confident, but you're kind of hedging all the time and you're saying, but, I'm not 100% sure, or, you're saying to them and you're communicating that to them, that can have a knock-on effect on their confidence too. And I know you mentioned elsewhere about within a team setting you were in before, of not allowing or making a rule that nobody was allowed to say, I can't do that, unless they follow it up with the word yet. And I actually wrote a post a couple of years ago about the same thing, and it's something I fully believe in. It's that importance of language, both in terms of communicating with other people and clients, but also self-talk as well. And I wonder, within that context of, in general, of language and the importance of it, are there any other things that you implement or are wary of when it comes to communicating with clients, just in general?
Loads, so many, probably I can't reel them off the top of my head, but it's interesting. What you've kind of reminded me of there is that that statement, I suppose, or that experience you're referring to, was working with a ladies panel, and working with a ladies panel at the exact same time as working with a men's panel, like, just showed me so much about psychology, I suppose, and the difference in that when I went into the gym with the men's panel, either hurling or football, I was always constantly having to pull weight off the bar or get the athletes to reduce the amount of load that they were putting their body through so that they could focus on the actual quality of the reps. Whereas when I went in with the ladies panel or the female panel, I was constantly having to try and motivate them and give them confidence to put more weight on the bar, and to execute it with more intent, because intent in terms of intent of application, so more velocity or more force, I would say, because they probably didn't have the training age of the male athletes, but as well as that, for whatever reason, they didn't have the same self-efficacy in the gym or the same confidence. So I was constantly having to show them that they were capable and kind of hype them up, essentially, and also push them a little bit more. Whereas with the men's team, I was having to pull them back quite a bit. So that was really good for my use of language, because I was trying to treat initially the ladies panel as the exact same as a men's team, which is I suppose I thought was the right thing to be doing in terms of equality, etc. But from many mistakes and from reading through research and from listening to podcasts and stuff, I realized throughout the season, this is wrong. I shouldn't be doing this, because in some areas I was trying to get the female team or the ladies team to start to put a process together of their game plan and how they communicate on the field. And I was doing the exact same thing with the men's team. And I'd worked with rugby teams in the past, all male dominated, all men's teams. And it was very direct in terms of communication. 1 word, 2 words, 3 words. This is what you do, or this is the call. We're executing this. You wouldn't need to say anything. Game plan is like 3 points. Do these, we'll win the game. We were having meetings with the ladies panel. We were going on for 20 minutes and everybody was voicing and their opinion and chatting and talking about what they were doing and all this. And I was pulling my hair out, if I had any hair at the time. And I was saying, like, come on, we need to train. We need to execute this. And then I came across a study that was in relation to instructions, and they tested male and female people in terms of instructions to put something together. They were offered either less words or more words in the instructions. All of the men, or majority of the men in the study, pretty much all of them, went for less words, and all of the females went for more words. And I saw the same thing in terms of the coachability of the athletes. The players on the field wanted like less complex direction from the coach. They wanted 1 or 2 points. And in some cases, they didn't want any direction at all. They just thought they were great so they could go do whatever the hell they wanted on the field. Whereas the ladies panel were constantly looking for reassurance if they're doing the right thing and can we do this? And you'd set up a drill, or you'd set up like a game in training for like change of direction or whatever, and I'd state what the rules were, and the lads panel would constantly just try to cheat straight away and say, well, you never said you couldn't do that. And the ladies panel would be asking me questions about, well, what should we do if this happens here then? And I'm like, oh, let's just figure it out and get into the drill. And then after I came across that study, I realized I was an idiot. And I was coaching in the wrong way. I was treating them the exact same when I shouldn't have been at all. I should have been treating them in the appropriate way. So what they needed from me was different for both panels. They needed me to be a different coach. So my communication style then started to change. I started to allow them to be really concrete in terms of, well, not allow them is wrong because it sounds like I'm overbearing, but I gave more time or dedicated more time for those conversations, because I knew that that's what they needed to have more confidence, and I facilitated it a little bit more. And one thing as well in the gym was the ladies would always say I can't, so I banned them saying I can't unless they said the word yes at the end of the sentence, because I was constantly trying to motivate them to do things and show them that they could do things and saying, put another 5 kilos on the bar. And they constantly kept saying, I can't. I can't yet was allowed, but I can't was not allowed. So if they said I can't, they had to give it a go. As well as that, what I saw was in the ladies panel, when we put in for training or who's available for training, now, this is getting really nitpicky, but I'm big on language. A lot of the athletes that were currently going through the return to play process or rehabbing would say, can't, I'm injured. And I thought that was very passive. It's like injury has happened to me and I can do nothing about it. So I chose to change that. They were no longer allowed to say I'm injured or injured for missing training. They said, can't, I'm rehabbing. Because it showed that they were taking control or some element of control in the process. They were stating that they had the capabilities to get back, but also they were actively trying to get back. Whereas if they said I'm injured, the ladies or the rest of the teammates might have been thinking like, oh, sure, they're not here, they're not doing anything. Whereas injury is very difficult for the athlete. And it's not like you're doing nothing. In a lot of cases, you're doing more than you were when you were playing. So they're showing that they are doing their best to get back, but also changing their mentality around injury, that they have no control over it, that it's just happening to them, but saying that, look, I can do my best to try to get back and also to reduce the risk of this happening again. So that's one aspect of working with teams. But in relation to working with individuals, I probably naturally now change in terms of my communication style with athlete that's in front of me, depending on what they need. So some athletes I work with require a lot less direction and probably and use of communication, I suppose, than others. Some book calls regularly, and what I've noticed is the ladies athletes or female athletes that are rehabbing with me or returning to play with me, they're much more frequent with the calls because they want to go through every single intricate detail. The male athletes are way less frequent. Sometimes I might hear from them for months, and then I say, or for weeks, and I say, how are you doing? What's the story? And say, oh yeah, all going good. And I was like, do you have any video or do you have anything to go through? Oh no, didn't video it. And I was like, well, can you video it, please? And can we jump on a call next week? So as a result of that, your language is going to have to be different, but you have to be quite careful in terms of your use of language as a coach, because people come to me all the time with previous injury history, but also self-limiting beliefs and beliefs around the functionality of their body and how their body moves because of what some physio or therapist had said to them in the past, in terms of, oh, well, you've one leg longer than the other, you're always going to have that pain, or you have two vertebrae out of alignment, which I don't even know what that one, navigating that one is a strange one. So you're always going to have this sciatica present or whatever. You have to keep coming into me every week for the next rest of your life, basically, to sort it out. So like trying to change those beliefs is number one, and that's a hard process because belief and trust are the number one things throughout the rehab process. They have to believe that they can and believe that you can guide them to a higher level of function, and they have to trust that you will do your best to do so, but also trust that you're capable of doing so too. If you don't have those things, you're pissing into the wind. Like, it's no good whatsoever. You're never going to achieve what's necessary to be achieved. So you just have to show you care, really. It comes back to something Adrian O'Brien said on a call years and years ago, and it was like, athletes do not care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that's something that I try to convey. I probably don't even try to convey it. It's probably partly because I've had so much and so many struggles with injury through my athletic career in the past that I can empathize with them quite a bit, and I know how they're feeling, and I don't want another human being to feel like that. And I also know that they don't have to feel like that if we focus on the right things and improve their level of physical function and their capability, I suppose. So I'm constantly trying to, and reframing it, that I don't want somebody to be in a position where I was being told things that were limiting my behavior and not really feeling like I was getting any help whatsoever, and also not being supported or cared about whatsoever. So that's one of my real missions, I suppose, with what I'm doing, is to try to be the person that I needed back then, if that makes sense. That's gotten very deep all of a sudden, but I hope it answers your question. It should.
Yeah, and people will think you're being somewhat pedantic when you're nitpicking at how the language that they're using. But if it is something that is important, and it is something that actually has an effect, and even if you were someone that didn't believe in, the idea of changing your language, or that it didn't have any effect, if you had to pick one, if you had to say, if your life depended on this and you had to bet, if I use positive language or if I use negative language, which is going to help me get back to play, or which is going to help me perform better, everyone would pick the positive language. And people will also have some skepticism in saying that, well, am I just sort of lying to myself if I'm saying the positive thing all the time? But it's not about that. It's about choosing the positive out of the two true things. It may be the case that you're injured, but it's also the case that you're rehabbing. Just if you're choosing the more positive one, you're not lying to yourself. You're just choosing to actually believe the one truth out of the two. A lot more that I can go in. Go ahead.
David Gray pulls me up on that a lot, actually. And we've had arguments about it in the past, because I would always say that I focus on the positive. And he said, well, it's not about being positive. It's about being realistic. And I was like, but I've said to him, the positive is realistic.
Yeah.
Because it can be true. And he said, yeah, exactly. So you're not being positive, you're being realistic. And I would say, well, can I not be both?
Well, if you take that example, you could say both of those things are realistic. It's realistic to say that you have a pulled muscle. It's also realistic to say that you are working on improving your ability to get back. So the realistic probably covers all of those, but you have to choose which of the realistic elements that you're going to choose to go with. I other things that I go into, but I know that we're conscious of time. I don't want to waffle on too long. So a few quicker questions just to finish off, just to see us out. So the first one was, because I know you're a golfer. So what's your favorite golf brand for clubs?
Oh, I have a set of Nike Reds that they don't make anymore, and I got really lucky with them actually down in Australia, because I arrived to Australia with no clubs, and my friends all play golf down there as well, and we said we'd go playing golf. And you can rent clubs pretty cheaply out there, but I knew I was going to be there for quite a while, so the lad said, why don't you just look on Gumtree for a cheapo set? It's kind of like the buy and sell in Ireland. And so I went on and I was looking at these clubs. Like, it was a putter, it had a driver, and then this full set of wedges and irons that looked incredible. And I was like, surely this is a scam. Surely this isn't real. Now, it was a good bit up the road. It was about an hour drive, but and they were really cheap as well. So for the full set, including the bag, was, I think he had up $200 or something, which is about 60%. It's about between 120 to 140 euro in and around there. So really cheap for clubs that were so good as well. So I just said, look, I'll message him, and I messaged him that I give him 150 for them, and he messaged me back and said 140, and I said, grand, 140. He said, no, that's too little. 220. And I was like, you just said 140 there. And he said, no, I didn't. I meant 240. I was like, what is going on? So I started thinking this guy is just an older gentleman trying to get rid of his clubs. It transpired anyway. It was two 14-year-olds selling their granddad's clubs. So I gave them the full 200 quid or whatever, and took the clubs and played really well with them actually down in Oz. So then I ended up taking them home. So my favorite brand of club is Nike for sure, but they don't make clubs anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, touch wood.
Well, fortunately for me.
Touch wood, you don't break any of them, or you'll have no replacement.
I know, exactly. I'll have to get them.
So out of driving, irons, pitching, and putting, where's your strength and weakness?
Oh God, depends on the day. I'd say I've been told my strength is my long irons. I'm pretty accurate, and I'm pretty good with my 3 to 5 iron probably. My weakness is, in fact, I would say, a very specific distance. My weakness is, in fact, probably 80 to 100 meters. And it's because of the way I play. So I would hit a 60 degree around the green a decent amount, and the max my 60 probably goes is about 80 meters. And then I hit a pitching wedge too far. So I hit a pitching wedge about 130 meters sometimes. So I have a gap wedge that I can hit about 110, 115 meters in and around, but I've nothing really that I can hit in between, and I have to take off the club, swing off essentially, and I don't like doing that. So that's my weakness of my game. But Jesus, my driving can be very good or very erratic, and my putting is the exact same. So I've actually got a lesson penciled in tomorrow, and what I'm going to go over is driving, because if I drive the ball well, generally I'll play decently.
It's usually
there I am focusing on the negative more so than the positive.
There's an interesting conversation to be had there, but it's interesting. Usually from my experience, usually the long irons are the ones people would struggle with the most.
I know.
So what do you currently train for?
What do I train for? I train for confidence. I train for probably information, in terms of I will trial a lot of things with myself that I'll then try with athletes. Either athletes that are physically able and fit, I suppose, whatever that means, but uninjured or not rehabbing. Or I'll do things like in the gym essentially to trial things for athletes that are rehabbing as well. I do a decent amount of running and a decent amount of lifting, and that kind of keeps me going for now. But I also train to be prepared for if I do get the chance to go back playing sport soon, because I actually made the decision back in November to step away from working with teams, because when I started working with teams and started coaching a lot more, I at the same time had torn my ACL, but I just became very time poor, so I didn't have time to continue playing rugby. Now, since I've been chasing the sun and rugby is a winter sport, it hasn't been possible to play, but I'd like to be capable of playing should the opportunity arise in the future, I'd say. And I just love competition as well. So I've been playing a decent bit of tennis. When we're in Australia, I was playing a good bit of tag, or Oztag as they call it, playing a bit of tennis as well, and then playing a bit of basketball and golf. I'm very, very competitive, and I really enjoy a challenge against someone. So I train to win absolutely every game that I'm ever put into, which is not possible, I know, but I might as well try, I guess.
100%. All right, last one, and then we'll let you go. If you could have 1 to 3 people, let's say, that you could go for a coffee and chat with, say, to potentially get some maybe advice or knowledge or wisdom, could be someone present day or historical, who would the 1 to 3 people be?
Oh wow, that's a good question. So I was thinking initially, in the industry for advice, actually for knowledge. I thought that was the line of questioning, but then I'm just thinking now, probably outside the industry would know me better and probably would have more life experience. So they probably would be able to offer more advice. But the first person I wrote down, because I was thinking industry wise, was Dan Paff. He's genius. And I shouldn't say he's a genius, because that's actually probably not given full appreciation of how hard he's worked, but he's probably the most knowledgeable person. I know Alan Murdoch has said to me that he's an actual bona fide guru in how good he is, and I know a lot of people that have worked with him as well and say that he's just incredible. So I think from the industry standpoint and from a physical performance standpoint, I think he would be at the top of the pyramid for me, to learn from there. Aside from that, who would give good life advice? I probably would pick someone close. I'd probably pick like my late granddad, probably, for advice. Just because he did achieve a lot in his life, and I know we were quite close, and I was his first grandchild, so I think he's seen me through like days old the whole way up. So I think him probably. I've never seen him drink a coffee though, so maybe he'd have a cup of tea instead of a coffee. But I don't think that would be an issue. And then finally, who would I pick? Oh, I know who I'd pick actually. Who I probably admired a little bit too much and put on a pedestal, so didn't see the human in him, is Johnny Wilkinson. When I was growing up, I probably took his autobiography a little bit too much as an instructional manual, when he was probably trying to warn more so than inform the perils, I suppose, of obsession. So I became quite obsessive when I was younger, and it led to injury, I suppose, and it led to mental health issues, I suppose, in a roundabout way as well. But I listen quite a bit to his podcast, and I think he has wisdom beyond his years, and I'd love to pick his brain. I actually had set out when I started podcasting that himself, Ronan O'Gara, and Roy Keane were at the top of the list for the 3 I'd love to get on. I don't know if I'll get Roy Keane on anytime soon, but the other 2 I think are still possible, I guess. So maybe if I sat down with the three of them, it would still be a good conversation, but I think I wouldn't have the same value to offer in terms of my analysis of probably game demands that they would in that what they've achieved. But maybe I'd be able to ask the right questions to get the right answers, maybe.
Perfect. Yeah, definitely an interesting combo of people. Right, so where would you like people to go if they want to follow along or reach out to you with any questions or queries?
I'd say the best place for both of those is probably Instagram. So at Petey Performance on Instagram for following along. As you said, I'm probably most active there. I'll put up more stories there. I'm on TikTok, I'm on Twitter. I don't post that many tweets at the moment. I probably should be posting more, but my focus point has been Instagram and then posting the same content onto TikTok. It's just been useful, I suppose. It led to me kind of growing faster at a faster rate, as I said earlier. And then all of my longer form thoughts, I suppose, and where I probably feel I offer the most value, but I don't really know that. My audience can tell me where I offer the most value, would be my podcast, because I get to verbalize what I'm thinking. I get to go into more nuance, more detail, and I think offer more comprehensive information for people and comprehensive insight for people. So the Petey Performance Podcast is the name of my podcast. My solo episodes are where I do probably more of the talking, and then the Backdoor Cup podcast, I'm the question asker there, so they can probably catch me over there too. And I think that's pretty much it. So yeah, you can catch me Petey Performance at most places except for on Twitter, where I'm at Petey Perform 9.
Thanks for listening, and if you consider yourself an everyday athlete, whether you play sport or want to pursue other athletic goals, consider checking out the Everyday Athlete program at the link in the episode description. There you'll find what's involved in the program, testimonials from the lads we work with, and how to apply.